It's just past 11 at night, and Mark is standing in his garage, not fixing anything, not really doing anything at all. The overhead light hums. A half-finished project sits on the workbench, untouched for weeks. He's 58. His wife went to bed an hour ago after a conversation that started normal and ended the way it usually does. Her asking if something's wrong, him saying he's fine, both of them knowing the word doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. He's not angry. He's not sad, not exactly. He's just full, in a way he doesn't have language for, carrying something that's been building for months, maybe years, and instead of naming it, he came out here to the one room in the house where nobody expects him to talk. He picks up a wrench he doesn't need, sets it back down, stands there under the hum of the light, a grown man alone with a feeling he has no plan for, and no intention of sharing. If any part of that felt familiar, you're not alone in it, even though it probably feels that way most of the time. There's a particular kind of man who can talk for 20 minutes about the stock market, about an engine, about a game he watched last week, and go completely silent the moment the conversation turns toward him. He deflects with humor. He changes the subject with a question about you, genuinely curious, and genuinely relieved that the spotlight moved. He says, "I'm good," so automatically it barely registers as a lie, even to himself, a small, almost invisible act of emotional suppression repeated so many times it no longer feels like suppression at all. He carries stress home from work and processes it alone, in the car, in the shower, in the 15 minutes before anyone else wakes up, a private ritual of compartmentalization most men never even notice they're performing. He has opinions about everything except how he actually feels, because that particular subject was never given room to exist. Ask him what's wrong and watch the shutters come down, fast, practiced, almost instant. It isn't defensiveness exactly. Psychologically, it's closer to a conditioned response, a reflex built over decades, wired in so deep it fires before conscious thought ever gets a vote. This reflex didn't form in a vacuum. Psychologists would call it a learned survival strategy, shaped by an environment that punished one behavior and rewarded another until the punished behavior simply disappeared from view. It was built, brick by brick, by a culture that handed boys a very narrow definition of what a man was allowed to be. Composed, capable, unshaken. For generations, emotional expression in men was treated less like a human trait and more like a liability. Something that made you less reliable, less trustworthy, less of a man in the eyes of people whose approval mattered most. Locker rooms taught it. Workplaces reinforced it. Even language did the work quietly. Man up, walk it off, don't be so sensitive. Phrases so common they stopped sounding like instructions and started sounding like facts about the world. Researchers who study masculinity and mental health have repeatedly found that men are significantly less likely than women to seek support for emotional distress, not because they suffer less, but because the entire architecture around them was built to reward silence and punish disclosure. In psychological terms, this is how a defense mechanism becomes a personality trait. Repetition erases the memory of it ever being a choice. There's a generational layer to this too, one that makes the pattern even harder to break. Many of these men grew up watching their own fathers say almost nothing about anything that mattered. No talk of fear, of failure, of grief, sometimes not even at funerals. And plenty of them promised themselves they'd be different, that they'd raise sons who felt safe enough to speak. Many succeeded, at least on the surface. Their kids talked to them more than they ever talked to their own fathers. But the promise usually stopped at parenting. It rarely extended inward toward their own unspoken histories, which stayed exactly where they'd always been, filed away, inherited rather than healed. He can ask his son how he's really doing and mean it completely. He still can't answer that same question for himself. To understand where this really starts, you have to go back much earlier than adulthood, earlier than the workplace, earlier than any locker room, back to somewhere around 6 or 7 years old, the age when a child first learns what happens to his feelings when he shows them. A boy falls, scrapes his knee, and cries, and somewhere in that moment he receives a message, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, but almost always clear. That's enough now, you're okay, toughen up. It rarely comes from cruelty. Often it comes from parents who were taught the exact same lesson and are simply passing along what they believe is protection. But the boy doesn't hear preparation. He hears a verdict. Developmental psychologists call this a form of emotional conditioning, the process by which a child's internal working model of relationships gets built, not through what he's told, but through what actually happens each time he expresses need. If vulnerability is met with discomfort often enough, the nervous system draws its own conclusion long before language can argue with it. Needing things is unsafe. He learns, early and completely, that his interior life is something to manage privately, and by the time he's old enough to understand what happened to him, it no longer feels like something that happened. It feels like who he is. This is where the coping mechanism takes root, and it's smarter than it looks. Keeping things inside isn't laziness or stubbornness. It's a strategy built by a much younger version of himself that once worked. As a kid, silence kept him safe from ridicule. As a teenager, it kept him from being seen as weak in front of people whose judgment felt like survival. As an adult, that same strategy simply kept running unexamined, because it had never once failed catastrophically enough to be questioned. He built an identity on top of it, dependable, unshakable, the guy people lean on, and that identity became something to protect because if he cracked it open, even slightly, he'd have to face a version of himself he spent his whole life avoiding. One that needs things, one that isn't always fine. Here is where the contradiction lives, and it's sharper than it first appears. He wants to be known. Genuinely, deeply, he wants someone to see past the composed exterior and understand what's actually happening underneath it. And at the exact same time, he will do almost anything to prevent that from happening. A pattern psychologist sometimes describe as approach avoidance, where the very thing a person longs for is also the thing they instinctively flee. He'll sit across from someone he trusts completely and still say it's nothing when it's clearly something. He'll carry a private grief for years without mentioning it, not because he doesn't trust them, but because naming it would make it real in a way he's not prepared for. He envies people who cry easily, who ask for help without flinching, and yet he wouldn't trade places with them, because that ease looks, to him, dangerously close to exposure. Strength and vulnerability get filed as opposites in his mind, even though every honest person who has ever actually been strong will tell you the two were never separate at all. What does it actually cost to keep everything inside for 30, 40, 50 years? Is the composure he's protecting really strength, or is it simply the most sophisticated form of hiding a person can build? When he says, "I don't need to talk about it," is that self-sufficiency, or a sentence rehearsed so many times it replaced the truth entirely? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of managing everything alone. Not visible exhaustion, but a quiet erosion that shows up as irritability, as distance, as a flatness he can't quite name. What would it mean to admit, if only to himself, that carrying everything alone was never proof of strength, but a habit that started as protection and slowly became a cage. There's another layer worth sitting with here, one rarely spoken aloud. Somewhere in him is still the boy who once cried freely, who said exactly what he felt without calculating the cost of saying it. That boy didn't disappear. He's simply been quiet so long that most people, including the man himself, have forgotten he's still in there, waiting for some signal that it might finally be safe to speak. That's a harder truth to face than believing he's incapable of vulnerability. Incapable can be excused. Choosing the silence again and again when the capacity was there the whole time, that's something else entirely. Consider what happens in the rare moments when a man like this does open up, even once, to someone he trusts. Almost universally, the emotion that follows isn't shame. It's relief, sometimes so overwhelming it surprises him. Men who finally speak the thing they've been holding back often describe a specific, almost physical sensation. Something loosening in the chest, or returning to a room that had gotten smaller without them noticing. Just as often, they describe disbelief at how long they waited, how much energy they spent protecting a secret that, once spoken, turned out to be survivable, even met with understanding rather than the judgment they'd spent a lifetime bracing for. The gap between the fear beforehand and the relief afterward tends to be enormous, and that gap says something important. The danger was never really in the telling. It was in the decades of imagining what the telling might cost. Maybe the real question isn't why men keep everything to themselves, but what they were told strength actually meant in the first place. Somewhere along the way, strength got defined as the absence of need, as never cracking, never asking, never letting anyone see the weight being carried. But there's another definition, quieter and far less discussed, where strength is the willingness to be witnessed exactly as you are, without performing certainty you don't feel. That version doesn't require constant composure. It requires honesty, which is harder and rarer, and far more costly to build after a lifetime of practicing the opposite. Mark doesn't know any of this standing in his garage. He just knows the light is humming, the house is quiet, and something in his chest hasn't loosened in longer than he can remember. Eventually, he'll turn off the light and go back inside. He'll get into bed beside his wife without a word about what kept him out there, and tomorrow will look exactly like today. Somewhere else, in another garage, another kitchen, another car parked outside a house he's not quite ready to enter, another man is carrying something just as heavy, believing just as firmly that he's the only one holding it. He isn't, and he never was. Nobody's telling him to change, and nobody's promising it would be easy if he did. Just this, that the silence he's standing in is far more common than he thinks, shared by more men than he'll ever know, all of them convinced that holding it together is the same thing as being strong, none of them quite certain where one ends and the other begins.